evening, everyone. I'm coming to you from rainy Santa Fe. It's actually pretty hard to believe how much rain we have, so you may hear thunder in the background. I'm Jim Falk, and before we get started with Ian, let me first thank Megan Torrey and Abby Noyes at the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. They have been so helpful in supporting this effort, promoting the podcast, and I'm very, very grateful, as well as to my friends at Global Santa Fe. And as some of you know, I'm back at the World Affairs Council of Dallas, Fort Worth, my former home and now current home as the interim president and CEO. And special thanks too to World Affairs Councils across the country who are part of the program. In fact, I need to give a special shout out to Jacksonville tonight. They have nearly 60 people on the program. So today we're going to be discussing a book that's been getting a lot of international attention, and here's the proof of it. Published just in May, Empty Vessel has already been translated or in the process of being translated into German, Arabic, Chinese, and Japanese. Joining us now is the author, Ian Kumekawa. He's a historian at the Center for History and Economics at Harvard University, where he earned, I should say, both his undergraduate and doctoral degrees in history. And he holds joint teaching appointments at Harvard and at MIT. Now, what I found so interesting about Empty Vessel and why it stood out is Ian took something that most of us wouldn't even give a second thought, and that's a barge. He used it to address many of the things that we often think about in geopolitics, issues surrounding the global economy and globalization. And like some of the books behind me, I have these titles behind me. I have Salt, I have Rust, I have Water. And it's a reminder, I think, to all of us how something that we consider ordinary can be used to tell really a compelling story. So, Ian, congratulations on the book. Thank you so much for being with us tonight on World Now.
Thank
And
you. Great to be here.
what we'll do is we'll talk for a little bit, but I'd really like our viewers to go ahead and put questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to just as many of them as we can. And as regular participants know, I like to weave those questions in throughout the conversation. So let's get started. Ian, as I said, this is an inanimate, in a sense, object. What led you to write a book about a barge?
Well, it was the middle of the pandemic in early 2021, and my wife and I were living in New York. My wife is a lawyer, a public defender, and she had clients who were incarcerated on what was then the last prison barge in the United States. This is a ship that was called the Boat, that was moored across from Rikers Island in New York. And I just became fascinated by the fact that there was in 2021 still a prison ship in New York. By training, I'm a historian of the British Empire, and so it immediately called to mind the hulks that were such features of British imperial history in the 18th and 19th centuries. Anyway, it's the middle of the pandemic, and as one does, one falls down a Google rabbit hole. And I realized that the barge that was in New York at that time had actually replaced another barge that was moored in New York in the 90s that was moored off of the Lower East Side, in a what is now a much higher rent district. And that barge just had the most remarkable history. It starts out being built in a government-owned shipyard in Sweden in the 70s. The idea is that it's meant to accommodate offshore oil workers in the North Sea. It's basically the way that it can do this is it's a flat-bottomed barge, but mounted on that steel hull are 5 layers, 5 levels of modified shipping containers. So it starts off in Sweden, it goes to the North Sea, it becomes a barracks for British troops in the Falklands. It goes to West Germany, where it's used by Volkswagen to house car workers. Then it goes to New York, where it's a jail, goes to England, where it's a prison, ends up in Nigeria, where it's again put in service of offshore oil. And along the way, what is so remarkable is that it participates in so many facets of the offshore world. Not only is it literally offshore as a ship, but it's involved in offshore oil. It's leveraged by companies that are registered in tax havens. It itself flies a series of flags of convenience as it's registered in Caribbean tax havens. It's the subject of commercial arbitration. And so what I realized is that this unassuming object actually was a remarkable vehicle for describing the emergence of the offshore world and the corresponding changes in the global economy.
Well, one of the things that struck me too was the different ownership. And we talk about the physical aspect of the barge, but people invested in it and wanted to be a part of the action because of the financial advantages that they could receive, largely tax aversion.
Right. So at the very beginning, as I said, it's built in this government-owned Swedish shipyard, and the Swedish state had recently taken over shipyards as a way of trying to resuscitate the declining shipbuilding industry. So on the one hand, it's the product of state support. On the other hand, it is commissioned by really an archetypical capitalist, Parley Augustsson, who is a real pioneer in the Norwegian shipping trade, is the first is the person who commissions the vessel. And the reason he does, one of the big reasons he does, is that the tax code in Norway means that the top income bracket is paying nearly 90% of a marginal income tax. And what that means is there are a bunch of very wealthy Norwegians who are looking for ways to get out of paying taxes to shelter their assets. Now, one of the very important loopholes in the Norwegian tax code is that if you invest in Norwegian shipping, you can basically write off much of that investment off your taxes. And so what this shipping magnate and also financier realizes is that he can partner with wealthy Norwegians. One of his very good friends is a dentist and is interested in sheltering assets to create these limited liability partnerships. And these limited liability partnerships then each buy a ship, and then everybody involved can write these assets off their taxes.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is a very old story for sure, and
But
one.
the original intent and their hope was that the barge would largely be used in the oil and gas industry.
Right.
Uh, Go ahead.
This is a time when offshore oil and gas is really taking off, especially in the North Sea. Now, uh, the first wells are drilled in the North Sea in the 60s, but it's really not until the late 70s that the sectors are just taking off. And this is a boom industry. And the investors in this ship all are thinking that it can be a service vessel for North Sea oil. And so even though Sweden is not on the North Sea, it actually develops quite a robust industry for the creation of offshore oil and gas servicing.
So a shipping container, you mentioned this, that people lived in a shipping container. That doesn't sound like where I'd want to go. And
Yeah,
give us a sense. It was very hard to find photos that we could show on tonight's podcast about what the ship looked like, especially the interior of the containers that you were able to get permission to include in the book. But we do have this picture, and it was a stamp at one point. But tell us what it's like, what it was like, whether you were a prisoner or whether you were a worker for Volkswagen or a soldier.
right. Well, this is the great logic of the shipping container is that it can contain really anything, or in this case, anyone, whether you're a soldier or a prisoner or an automobile worker or an offshore oil worker. The container contains anyone. Um, well, one answer to your question is what is it like really low ceilings, of course, would be one way of answering it. But the spaces inside are confined. They're quite cramped. Um, it's billed originally by its promoters as luxury accommodation for offshore oil workers. The sort of neologism that gets used is flotel or coastel, evoking the comforts of a hotel. And of course, once the people who uh, this vessel is intended for get on it, the complaints are immediate and endless. But
Well,
then,
plumbing is probably not very good.
oh, the plumbing is awful. They have I won't sicken your stomach, but the vacuum toilet system is very much prone to malfunction over the years. But so its build is luxurious. It's not. But when it gets to New York and is used as a jail, critics think it is far too luxurious to be used as a jail. In particular, one of the things that critics really take issue with in the records is what they call, and you can imagine the scare quotes, luxurious European style shower heads. And this is deemed just far too good, far too luxurious, far too comfortable for people that the city has been arresting and incarcerating.
What about security when it was used as a jail or prison?
Yes. So it because it's not designed as a prison or a jail, there were a lot of concerns about line of sight. One of the ways in which the city jerry-rigged the space or adapted the space was to actually weld shut many of the fire doors. And it's worth noting that they could do that because um, this was an international vessel moored literally offshore. The health and safety, the fire codes did not apply to it. Zoning did not apply to it.
Right there on the Hudson River.
Right there on the well, this was actually on the East River.
Okay.
The same logic applies. Just really steps from New York. You can see there between I think that's the Manhattan Bridge. And there it is. And there also you can see the sort of modular shipping container like structure. Um, uh, so yes, these local ordinances and zoning regulations and fire safety did not apply because it was an international vessel governed by international treaties, and the Coast Guard is in charge of inspection, and New York City fire codes were not operative.
What about the cost of some of this conversion? And what's the value? What was the cost to build the original barge, and how did its value change over time?
The original cost of the barge is, in 1980 dollars, maybe about $7 million. Um, it's the value of the barge fluctuates a great deal, but it always makes its owners a very tidy profit. And one of the reasons that it makes its owners a very tidy profit, and I should say it's, for the vast majority of its existence, it has been owned by private owners. There's only a very short period where it's owned by the British state when it's a prison in the UK. Um, and the reason that it's so profitable is that the vessel is always demanded in times of crisis. It comes to New York because this is in the middle of the war on drugs. The arrest rate is surging. Prisons and jails are really overcrowded. There's a court order to reduce overcrowding. And so what is the city going to do? It can't just turn around and build a new jail. It can't convert a building to be a jail because of land use rules. It has to bring something in. It has to think outside the box, or it has to think, inside the box in this sense. And similarly, in the Falklands, you saw the stamp there. It goes to the Falklands because the British have won the Falklands War, but they need to billet 8,000 soldiers on the Falklands to ensure that the Argentinians don't come back and retake the islands. So you have a crisis. And in times of crisis, especially cities and states and countries are really willing to pay whatever it takes to meet that crisis. Um, and so that's why the vessel becomes incredibly valuable for its private owners.
Where is it now?
It's in Nigeria. It's in a free zone outside of Onne, which is a port city in Nigeria. And at the moment, it has not been in service really since 2017 or 2018. It's laid up. It's in on an estuary, and the last I have heard, which was about a year ago, it was completely covered in black mold. So there's no plans to put it back into service. Although a few years ago, I believe it was during the pandemic, there was an inquiry from the Brazilian government, the Bolsonaro government, to repurpose it as a prison again.
Have to ask, have you touched it? Have you been on it?
I have not. It is in this free zone in Nigeria, and access was a little difficult to arrange.
I can appreciate that. One of the chapters that I found especially interesting was this whole issue of the flags of convenience, because it started out being owned and carrying the flag of European countries. And it's not just in the case of what we call the vessel, but we're seeing this with some, basically in the shipping industry. Take a few minutes and tell us about that evolution and what your own thoughts are about that.
Right. Flags of convenience really started taking off in the 1970s. And what is meant by flag of convenience is basically anytime a ship flies a flag to which it does not have a meaningful, the language that gets used a lot, starting with UNCLOS in 1958, is a genuine link between the ship or the ship owner and the country whose flag the ship flies. So historically, the big flags of convenience have been Panama, Liberia, the Liberian Registry, which was set up by Edward Stettinius in the aftermath of World War II. But they really take off in the 1970s when European, American, especially British, Greek, American ship owners realize that there are tremendous benefits, financial benefits to be gained from registering ships in places that don't charge taxes or charge very, very low taxes, whose fees are very low, whose labor regulations are comparatively lax. And most importantly, by registering a ship in a foreign country, you can obviate the power of the local unions back at home. And so seafarers' unions are really left out in the cold when ship owners move to flags of convenience. And this is certainly what happens in the case of the vessel and the several other ships that its owners, British owners, register in the Bahamas. The Bahamas, I should say, becomes a very important flag of convenience, especially for British ship owners. The Bahamas is a former colony. It's part of the Commonwealth. The Bahamas opens up a registry office in London so that in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, it's incredibly easy for British ship owners to just, take a taxi ride and show up at the Bahamian registry office and in a day re-register their ships.
And we saw this really in a painful way during COVID, where some of the seafarers were just, and we're talking whether it's cruise ships or large tankers or people who were responsible for barges, right? They were trapped on their vessels.
Right, exactly. There are enforcing safety regulations, enforcing labor regulations is really hard on the high seas. And especially when seafarers are not protected by strong domestic unions, as had been the case 50 years ago, securing rights for those seafarers becomes a very tall order.
You also addressed and discussed the insurance industry, and we've all heard of Lloyd's of London, but there's a lot more to all of that. And I bet a lot of our viewers really aren't familiar about how that works and the classification and the value.
Right. So in essence, in this world where ships can be registered in these flags of convenience, and I should say that 77% of the world's tonnage is registered in a flag of convenience at this point, or thereabouts. Uh,
Yeah, let me just say what it is. 13% in 1958, this was from your book, 42% in 1990, and in 2020, 73%.
right. I mean, it's just a staggering increase.
Excuse me.
Um, and and uh, in this world, the way that safety standards, in terms of the physical construction and the outfitting of ships, are maintained and enforced, is through a system of what are called classification societies. These are private organizations that inspect and guarantee the quality of shipping vessels and much of the equipment that is on these vessels. And without an inspection from one of these private societies, insurers won't insure these ships. And without insurance, basically, the risk is just far too great to operate a vessel of any size. And so the way in which the industry works is really through this private parallel world of regulation, something that I think certainly at the beginning of this project, I would have thought the state would have a much larger role in, but actually falls to these private organizations.
Now, is that where the IMO fits in, which seems to have been captured by really the people who should be regulated?
Well, the IMO is the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN body, um, is responsible for serving a coordinating function for a lot of the disparate regulations that exist, and maintaining standards. It's certainly very much in dialogue with, in close communication with the classification societies. It also is, and I talk about this in the last chapter of the book, and it's very involved in actually trying to render assistance to seafarers who have been abandoned or stranded on vessels. Um, but one of the realities is that much of the funding for the IMO is determined by um, how large a country's shipping registry is. So the funding comes disproportionately from countries that maintain open registries, they maintain these flags of convenience. And of course, that creates maybe not incentives, but it creates a system in which those countries are obviously interested in protecting certain parts of the status quo.
Is there a political issue, say in the Bahamas or Panama? Is there opposition to how the registry in these countries allow people to be mistreated, frankly?
There has been a long dialogue about this. Uh, uh, but the people who are really hurt don't have strong or powerful forces backing their claims. I mean, it's
And they're not nationalities of that country,
they're not nationalities. They're
citizens.
often nationalities of countries that are not uh, either the country that's maintaining the flag of convenience, nor are they from countries that are wealthy in the global north. And so it's just not a priority, for instance. It's not a high priority, for instance, for the Indian government to make claims on changing the system.
Greg Osick. Greg, thanks so much. You are often on our programs. I appreciate it. Greg asks about the impact of climate change on how the barge has been used in different countries or at different times.
Yeah, it's a great question. Uh, you know, it emerges in this burgeoning period of offshore oil in the North Sea when countries like Norway and Denmark that are now divesting and investing in green energy are investing very heavily in fossil fuels, and indeed becoming incredibly rich off of fossil fuels. Um, it ends up in Nigeria back in the service of offshore oil. But I think there's something really symbolically important about the fact that when it arrives in Nigeria, its air conditioning systems cannot keep up with the Nigerian heat. And so it is always operating in Nigeria at very substantially reduced capacity. Uh, it's not a direct, it's not a direct, obviously, result of climate change, Nigeria is much hotter than the North Sea, where these systems were designed, what these systems were designed for. But it is used at reduced capacity by the time it gets used in the oil sector in the 2010s.
We have just a few minutes left, and I want to be sure to bring in Lawazi Bulu. He asked, can you speak to the connection between the use of the barge as a prison in times of mass incarceration and President Trump's mass deportation and sending immigrants to foreign prisons as another example of exporting incarceration?
Yeah, it's a really important parallel. And again, the parallel I think has to do with the use of offshore spaces as expedients. Um, Offshore spaces allow for very publicized, um, and I use this term very much in scare quotes, quick fixes. Um, they can get around certain regulations. They can get around certain normal procedural hurdles that have been established for reasons. Um, and so New York's turn to incarcerating people offshore is in that way very similar to Donald Trump's decision to send people to Guantanamo Bay and El Salvador. It is the use of the offshore as a place that in which legal jurisdiction can be used to the advantage of administrators.
There's such uncertainty now about the tariffs and the impact that they will have on ports, but comment a bit about that, how quickly we saw Long Beach lose so much of its tonnage and what we might expect in the future, and how that will really have dramatic impact that I don't think people are realizing on employment at all of these ports, because we've seen this, as you point out, in various other stages of history.
Right. Yes, they say that every four containers is a job in the United States, in the great system of global trade. The reduction of global trade is certainly going to change the economic landscape in ways that are going to be, of course, for the shipping industry, for anyone involved in imports, really, really devastating and pernicious. Um, One thing that I have been thinking a lot about as the Trump administration rolls out its shifting policies around trade and tariffs, is that in a certain way, we're really poised to see the fundamental growth of the offshore world, the global offshore. In times of great economic uncertainty, individuals and corporations look to shelter their assets in havens, particularly tax havens. But also in the lead up to so-called Liberation Day and in the whatever it is, month and a half since, um, uh, we have seen a tremendous uptick in interest in foreign trade zones, which are, in essence, free trade zones which exist within the United States, as companies and importers seek to find ways around an uncertain trade regime. So these offshore spaces, these spaces of exception, are going to become ever more important in a landscape of trade uncertainty.
Robert Larrick says, don't we all need UN universal standards? Probably impossible, but that's a good point.
Yes, I think the short answer is yes.
And Jim Stoddard, how can new low carbon shipping be incentivized when these major shipping centers, nations like Panama or Liberia, are so financially autonomous and globally, he says, irresponsible?
Right. I think, this is not my area of expertise, but I think that an appeal has to be made to the consuming public. Um, the financial incentives for ship owners to register in flags of convenience like Liberia or Panama um, don't don't necessarily impact any savings they might experience from if the cost of oil goes through the roof and low carbon shipping becomes a more economically viable alternative as well. So that's another factor to consider.
What are you working on now?
I'm working on a book called The Business State, which is a historical investigation of how the British imperial state was captured by big business in the early 20th century. And it's all about the ways in which big business and government bureaucrats became friends, really, and colleagues during World War One, and how those relationships proved tremendously durable and important for the subsequent shape of the state.
That sounds very interesting. When's it coming out?
There's not been a date set, but I'm guessing it's probably going to be late next year.
Well, I hope I can get a commitment from you to come back and talk
I would
about it.
love that.
So let me just remind everybody, the book is Empty Vessel, The Story of the Global Economy in One Barge. The author is Ian Kumekawa. It's been great having time with you. And I hope other World Affairs Councils will invite you to come talk about your book.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure being here.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for being with us on World Now. I'm Jim Falk.